In the early hours of June 26, 1830, the royal chambers of Windsor Castle reeked not of incense or flowers, but of decay. The air was thick and heavy, clinging to the skin like damp cloth. Beyond the velvet curtains, the great king of the United Kingdom sat slumped in a specially built chair because his body, grotesquely swollen and suffocating under its own weight, could no longer lie flat without crushing his lungs. His breathing came in wet, ragged gasps, each one a battle, each one a reminder that his once celebrated body had become a prison of rotting flesh. The candles flickered, casting tremulous shadows across his bloated face, once the most handsome in Europe, now unrecognizable. His skin had taken on the gray pallor of something already halfway to the grave. His servants, those few who still dared to remain in the room, kept their distance, not out of respect, but out of revulsion. The smell, the sickly sweet stench of unwashed folds, infected sores, and organs failing one by one, was enough to make even hardened palace staff gag. This was George IV, the man once called the first gentleman of England, a prince born into every advantage, intelligence, charm, beauty, the boundless wealth of empire, a man who could have been a beloved ruler, but decades of indulgence had hollowed him out from the inside. The feasts, the wine, the mistresses, the silks and jewels, all of it had piled upon his body and soul like a slow, crushing avalanche. Now the avalanche was complete. There were no crowds keeping vigil outside the gates, no whispered prayers for his deliverance. Beyond these walls, London slept or drank or laughed, knowing the king was dying. The press had already sharpened their pens for the obituary. When he was gone, there would be no public grief, no tear shed without payment, only relief. And so, as the clock crept toward 3 in the morning, the man who had once been the shining star of Britain sat dying in his own stench. Clinging to life he no longer had the strength to enjoy. His final words, whether a plea to God or a cry of disbelief, were lost in the thick air of that room. Moments later, George IV, king, libertine, glutton, ghost of his former self, slid into death. But to understand how this Prince of Promise became a monarch of misery, we must return to the beginning. Part 1. The Golden Prince. He was born George Augustus Frederick on August 12, 1762, an heir not merely to a throne, but to the weight of an empire that spanned oceans. His cradle was carved from mahogany, gilded in gold leaf, and rocked beneath ceilings frescoed with the myths of kings and gods. Even in infancy, he was a symbol, a living promise that the Georgian line would endure. As the first son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, his path was drawn long before he could walk it. His life script was etched in the ceremonial language of crowns and scepters, of royal decrees and dynastic marriages. But destiny was not the only thing that set him apart. There was a presence to him, an ease that needed no teaching. In the rarefied air of the Georgian court, where every gesture was measured, every word weighed, George moved like a beam of sunlight through leaded glass. His tutors praised his intellect, his companions, his wit. His eyes were bright, his voice warm, his laugh quick and generous. The ladies of London whispered of him behind painted fans, calling him the most handsome man in Britain. Even the caricaturists of the day, who could turn beauty into absurdity with a few strokes of the pen, found little to exaggerate. But the splendor of his early promise concealed hairline fractures. His father, George III, was a man of relentless moral discipline who ruled his household as strictly as he ruled his kingdom. The royal apartments smelled of candle wax and starch, their hours divided between scripture, political study, and the sober duties of state. Pleasure was not merely frowned upon, it was treated as a sin. For the young prince, this was suffocation. He saw not the virtue of restraint, but the chains of it. Behind every locked cabinet, every closed curtain, he imagined the pleasures being denied to him. The scent of wine on a lover's lips, the shimmer of candlelight on silk, the rush of music and laughter that spilled from the private salons of London's elite. When he reached his majority at 21, the prison gates swung open. His escape was Carlton House, a grand residence on Pall Mall that he transformed into his own kingdom of indulgence. Gone were the cold sermons and regimented hours of his father's court. In their place, feasts where tables groaned under silver platters of venison and pheasant, wines imported from France by the cask, orchestras that played until the windows were pale with mourning. The air at Carlton House was thick with perfume, tobacco, and intrigue. Crystal glasses never emptied before they were refilled. Conversation rippled from politics to poetry to scandal, each topic sharper than the last. Women in silk gowns laughed too loudly. Men in powdered wigs whispered too closely. And always at the center, the prince himself, flushed with youth, magnetic with charm, already cultivating a taste for the kind of pleasure that does not fade but deepens into dependency. What no one yet understood, not his friends, not his father, not even George himself, was that this was not a phase. This hunger for excess was not a mere indulgence of youth. It was the axis upon which his life would turn. The shadow beneath the golden light had already begun to lengthen, and once shadows begin their slow march across the sun, they do not stop. Part 2. The Descent into Excess. By the mid-1780s, the golden surface had begun to dull. The promise of the prince, so dazzling, so full of potential, was slowly being swallowed by appetite. George's days began at a table more suited to a banquet hall than a breakfast room. 2 pigeons roasted in butter, 3 beefsteaks still bleeding from the pan, a bottle of white wine drained before the clock struck noon, champagne for brightness, port for body, brandy for courage, and this, he insisted, was merely to set the stomach. By afternoon, the air inside Carlton House grew thick with the perfume of roasting meats, rich sauces, and imported wines. Silver platters arrived in endless procession, each dish heavier, richer, more elaborate than the last. Laughter mingled with the clink of cutlery and the splash of wine into crystal. The dining room was an arena, and George, round-cheeked, flushed with drink, its reigning champion. Money, to him, was no more real than the clouds above London. His spending was feverish, impulsive, and absolute. He bought silks from Lion, snuff boxes encrusted with diamonds, fleets of gilded coaches that gleamed along Pall Mall. Painters from across Europe competed for his commissions. Architects sketched entire wings of Carlton House at his command, as if Britain's coffers were merely his personal purse. Debt piled like snow in winter, quiet at first, then all-consuming. By the 1790s, his obligations to merchants and moneylenders were staggering. Parliament, humiliated but bound by duty, paid them off again and again. Each rescue only deepened his conviction that the well could never run dry. His heart, so quick to love and quicker to tire, entangled him in scandal after scandal. In 1785, he secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic whose very presence in his bed violated the laws of the realm. The marriage was a collision of passion and defiance, conducted under the shadow of political danger. When duty forced him, a decade later, into an official union with Princess Caroline of Brunswick, disaster struck before the vows were even spoken. Their first meeting ended in mutual disgust. He found her vulgar. She found him fat and not half as handsome as his portrait. On their wedding night, he drank himself into unconsciousness, collapsing before consummation could even be attempted. From then on, the marriage became an open war. Caroline mocked him in public. George barred her from court, struck her name from the Book of Common Prayer, and schemed to keep her from his coronation. Their feud became a national sport, devoured by satirical newspapers that painted the prince as a vain, petty tyrant. And all the while, his body was changing. By the time he reached his mid-30s, George weighed nearly 250 pounds, a staggering size for the age. The once chiseled face blurred into softness, chins multiplied, his waist swelled beyond the reach of fashionable tailoring. Still, vanity clung to him like a second skin. Corsets of whalebone crushed his torso into a semblance of elegance, leaving deep marks in his flesh. Rouge disguised the graying pallor, powdered wigs masked the thinning hair, but appetite is a current, and once it catches you, it pulls you faster than you can swim. George was no longer standing at the water's edge. He was adrift, sailing toward a horizon from which no man returns. Part 3. The Regent's Throne. In 1810, the mind of King George III, once sharp and unbending, fractured under the weight of madness. The court fell into a hushed panic. Ministers spoke in coded phrases. Curtains were drawn over the truth. But everyone knew the king could no longer rule. And so, by an act of Parliament, power passed to his eldest son. George, Prince of Wales, became the Prince Regent, ruler in all but name. It was the moment he had waited for all his life, the stage he had rehearsed in his mind through countless nights of wine and candlelight. He stepped into the role with the flourish of an actor, making his grand entrance. London would be his theater, Britain his audience. Under his patronage, the city blossomed into a glittering capital of the arts. Painters, poets, architects, and musicians flocked to his side, eager for royal favor. He commissioned grand avenues, ornamental gardens, and marble halls that caught the sunlight like something out of Rome's golden age. To the casual eye, it was a renaissance. But behind the gilded scenery, shadows lengthened. The Regent's Court was a carnival of appetite. Banquets began in the early afternoon and staggered into the next day, the tables groaning with roasted swans, spiced game, and towers of sugared confections. In just 6 weeks of 1816, Carlton House received more than 5,000 pounds of meat, not counting poultry or sausages, washed down with oceans of champagne, claret, and brandy. Between courses, he sipped laudanum, the opium-laced tonic that blurred his mind into a soft, dreamlike fog. Foreign envoys returned home with reports that straddled disbelief and disgust. One described a dinner where the regent, face flushed and eyes glassy, ate as if the act itself were a performance, fork moving with mechanical rhythm, words slurring between mouthfuls, laughter booming a second too late. The war with Napoleon had ended, but George liked to imagine himself a victor nonetheless. He hosted balls where he dressed in military uniforms heavy with gold braid and jeweled sashes, though he had never set foot on a battlefield. The irony was not lost on his detractors, who whispered that the only campaigns he had fought were at the dining table. When his father died in January 1820, George ascended the throne at last. The coronation was an orgy of spectacle. A robe of silver tissue that shimmered over his swollen frame, a crown blazing with 12,000 hired diamonds, processions that seemed to stretch for miles. The cost, nearly £1 million, was a staggering insult to a nation still nursing the wounds of war. But beneath the fanfare, the truth was inescapable. George IV was no longer the first gentleman of England. He had become a figure of ridicule, an object of satire for the press, a liability to Parliament, a king whose ministers learned to work around rather than with him. The throne he had dreamed of all his life was no longer a place of power. It was a stage, and he, its bloated, fading actor, performing for an audience that had already begun to turn away. Part 4. The Rotting King. By the mid-1820s, the illusion had cracked beyond repair. The silks, the diamonds, the whalebone corsets engineered to compress his girth, none could disguise the truth. The King of England was rotting in his own flesh. His legs swelled like overfilled barrels, the skin stretched to a sheen, blotched purple and red. Dropsy, fluid retention, made every step an act of torture. Gout gnawed at his feet, inflaming the joints until even the brush of a bedsheet felt like knives. His once elegant hands warped into claws, unable to hold a quill or a fork. Sleep no longer came in a bed. His chest, heavy with fat, crushed his lungs if he tried to lie flat, and so he dozed, sitting upright in a specially built chair, his massive head propped on one hand, his breathing a wet, rattling labor that shook his entire frame. But it was the smell that broke people. It clung to him like a second skin, creeping into the carpets, the curtains, the very stone of Windsor Castle. Years of unchecked weight had folded his body into deep creases, and in those shadowed valleys, sores festered. Infections took root, stubborn and weeping. The combination of rotting flesh, unwashed skin, and the sickly perfume of his medicines produced an odor so overpowering that even seasoned servants gagged when they entered his chambers. Some attendants tied cloth over their faces. Others simply refused certain duties. Courtiers spoke in whispers of how one could sense the king from a corridor away. Visitors would linger at the threshold rather than step fully inside, afraid that once the stench touched them, it would never leave. Mirrors vanished from his private rooms, not stolen, but removed at his own command. The man who had once spent hours perfecting his toilette could no longer bear the sight of his reflection. What had been vanity became avoidance. What had been pride became shame. He withdrew into a cycle of laudanum and wine, each feeding the other in a haze of narcotic half-life. At times, he raged, paranoid that his servants mocked him behind his back. At others, he wept openly, slumping in his chair like a discarded doll. On rare occasions, he appeared in public. He was wheeled out, powdered, painted, and draped in finery. But the deception fooled no one. Beneath the rouge, his skin was gray. Beneath the silks, his frame swelled like a carcass left too long in the sun. The people no longer saw a monarch. They saw a cautionary tale in human form. By 1829, Blindness from cataracts left him groping for furniture in rooms he had once commanded. His signature was replaced by a stamp. His speeches, when he attempted them, wandered into incoherent rambles. He was a king in name, but in reality, little more than a bloated relic, breathing and waiting for the inevitable. The rot was no longer metaphorical. It was in him, on him, around him. The crown on his head might still glitter, but the man beneath it had become a ruin. Part 5. The Death No One Mourned. By June 1830, Windsor Castle had become less a royal residence than a mausoleum in waiting. The curtains in the king's chambers were kept drawn, not to block the sun, but to hold in the warmth for a body that could no longer regulate its own heat. Servants moved through the corridors like ghosts, speaking in murmurs, carrying basins, bottles, and chamber pots. George IV was a man suspended between life and death. His body swelled grotesquely, his skin taut and shiny over deposits of fat that crushed his lungs and heart. Every breath was a struggle, a wheezing rasp that echoed in the stillness. He dozed upright in his great chair, head drooping forward, jaw slack, lips cracked from constant panting. The laudanum flowed in doses so large they could have felled another man twice over. It dulled the pain, but thickened the air around him, turning thought to fog. Food still arrived in absurd abundance, game, puddings, roasts, but he ate mechanically as if obeying a compulsion that had outlasted his hunger. Often, midway through a meal, he would freeze, gasping for air, his face mottled purple. Then, without a word, he would resume chewing. On the night of June 25th, the change came. His skin turned the color of old wax. His hands twitched with tremors. The room stank of sweat and decay so strongly that even the physicians could not mask their discomfort. Those who stood watch swore the air itself felt heavier, as if the walls were leaning in. Just after 3 a.m, a spasm tore through him. Blood and fluid spilled from his bowels, a final, humiliating rupture of the body's last defenses. His eyes flew open, not in peace, but in alarm. He is said to have gasped for his physician, Sir Henry Halford, crying, "Sir Henry, fetch him! This is death!" Moments later, his massive head rolled sideways onto the shoulder of his page. His chest rose once, twice, and then no more. The autopsy was an anatomy lesson in self-destruction. Fat encased his heart like armor, squeezing it to failure. His liver was scarred by decades of drink. His stomach bore the rupture that had killed him. Every organ was swollen, strained, or ruined. Outside the castle, London stirred to the news with all the warmth of a winter dawn. There were no public vigils, no waves of black cloth in the streets. The Times wrote, with cold precision, "There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king." It was not cruelty. It was fact. The funeral became its own quiet scandal. The coffin had to be specially built from Spanish mahogany, reinforced with lead to hold the body's weight. The royal vault was strengthened to bear it. Those who attended did so with dry eyes, some with curiosity, others with relief. In whispers, they admitted what few dared to write. They had come not to mourn, but to confirm he was gone. And so, the curtain fell on George IV's life, not with the thunder of grief, but with the soft, almost welcome silence of an empire freed from its most exhausting king. The crown passed on, the smell lingered, and history at last close the book.